right, welcome everyone to the Friday Transportation Seminar. And today we have Ted Trepanier from INRIX here. He is the Senior Director for the Public Sector with INRIX, and he was formerly also the Director of Traffic Operations for the Washington Department of Transportation. And today he'll be speaking with us about 10 emerging megatrends: clouds, crowds, and traffic. And so we would like to extend a very warm welcome over to Ted.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me today. I'm excited to do this talk. Just a little bit of a precursor. This is new material for me. I am going, actually tomorrow, flying to China. I'm going to speak at 2 different transportation conferences in China. One related to automobiles and where they're going in the auto space, and one related to public sector at the Ministry of Transportation in Beijing. And so one of the interesting things about what I'm going to talk about today is that this is a global phenomenon that I'm going to talk about. So I've got examples from the U.S. and things that certainly you'll be able to relate to very well right here in Portland, but also pretty far-reaching. And so I do have some factoids that I'm going to kind of read rather than just speak completely off the cuff with the slides. So hopefully this will go well for you. And the whole idea as I put this together was to prompt some thinking. Right? So these are 10 trends, 10 megatrends that we see that are going to have a significant impact on the way people move around, mobility in general, and not just car-focused, which obviously in Portland you all can relate to very, very well, but the big picture in transportation. And then I have kind of my own challenge that I throw out at the end of this talk, specifically kind of to the planners, and certainly the folks that are working in traffic operations and day-to-day will be able to relate to it, I think, as well. But just something that I've been thinking about a lot as people look at the big needs that are on the system today, things like replacing the Columbia River Crossing Bridge and those types of infrastructure improvements where there's significant funding needed, right, for transportation infrastructure. And maybe some different ways we need to be thinking about that and talking about that. And so that's just a thought provoker from my perspective. So one slide on the company of INRIX, that I'm working for today, because INRIX is at the confluence of a lot of the trends that I'm going to talk about. And that is how information is changing transportation. And then, of course, the societal factors, that are affecting that will be the rest of the topic. But we're at this place right now where INRIX is integrating this vast amount of data. People talk about big data, but you're talking about data that is enormous in scope and growing ever so fast. And I'll talk about that a tiny bit. We're right now producing travel times and speeds on every link of the system where there's significant traffic. So this is over 1 million miles of roadway in the United States alone. We're doing that in 32 countries, and we're updating that once a minute. Okay? Just to give a tiny bit of the scope of that. And then making that on demand to a whole range of customers. Direct into automobiles, direct into traffic operations centers, and then all that data is archived for transportation planners to look at and go in and examine the trends. And then the folks that are in the government accountability side, the performance metrics, what did I get out of this investment? We can calculate the before and after, on any significant segment of roadway in the U.S. So that sort of thing. So now a little bit on the trends, the 10 trends. So I'm going to talk about the 10 trends, and then I'm going to show an example of what I call a twisted trend that I think you all have heard about by now, but one that I've actually been tracking for several years personally to kind of make this real, because it shows, I think, some of the things really starting to take hold already, and then the challenge. So the first megatrend is urbanization, right? So right now we've got about 51% of the population globally living in cities. And by 2050, that's going to grow to about 70%. In China, they've just announced an initiative to move I think it's 250 million people from the farms into the cities in the very short term. It was interesting when I was in China on my last trip. This was front page news there, and so not a evolutionary scale of moving, but picking up and creating new cities like Portland outside existing cities in just a matter of a couple of years, and dealing with that, and without a lot of new infrastructure to be put into place. So the trends here, as you see over just the scope of these few years, the mega cities that dwarf the size of New York City, cities that are plus 10 million, are going to grow from, I think it's like 17 to 27. So it's an enormous scope of urbanization. So the next thing is the cost of congestion itself, right? So this huge drain on the economy that is congestion is by itself precipitating change, right? Because people are tired of sitting in it. And this glamour of getting in my car and driving, is kind of gone, right? That's something my generation grew up with, right? Could hardly wait to get a car because the car meant mobility, meant freedom. It was really the only way I could get around. But just the staggering cost of congestion is changing that. The wasted time in congestion, so these are hours per year in different cities across the planet. And so just one factoid here is that even though we saw congestion falling by like 18% in 2012, in London alone, drivers are wasting 72 hours per year in traffic, even after a significant reduction in congestion. In Sao Paulo, Brazil, it's a typical commute that can be just a very few miles. It can be 2 to 3 hours, right? And so you see the rise of these types of devices, the motorcycles and scooters, and they're seeing the same kind of thing in Sao Paulo that I see in China. A lot of these people get killed, right? And so it's not unusual to see one fatality a day, even just driving around on a motorcycle, something that we would never tolerate here, as far as the cost of mobility. So let me just cover that. So pollution and climate change certainly is a mega trend that is significant. Where we've got, in the U.S. alone, wasting 1.9 billion gallons of fuel every year due to congestion, and a third of all the carbon emissions, are being contributed by transportation, by cars. And so the interesting factoid here that we picked up that to me is just amazing, related to the Carmageddon closures. So I don't know how many of you heard of Carmageddon? All right, so this is where they closed a section of the 405, they call it the 405, right, outside of LA, over a weekend for major construction. And so the term Carmageddon was how the media was talking about what was going to happen due to the closure of 405, because it's an enormous freeway section. And of course, it didn't materialize. Right? The congestion that was predicted didn't happen because people go, I ain't going out there. Right? And so they stayed home or they went a different way. And so the congestion didn't materialize that was predicted if you just took those trips and redistributed them, right, through a model, what you would expect to see. So the factoid is that according to the UCLA researchers that looked at the closure, it improved air quality along that corridor 83% over a typical weekend. And in the the greater Los Angeles metro, a 25% improvement in air quality because of the Carmageddon freeway closure and the way people reacted to it. To me, that's a very, very significant case pointing to to the impact of just the vehicles on the roadway related to congestion. And here becomes kind of the challenge, right? Is even though we're doing a lot of innovative things in the United States, and Europe, I think, is probably actually a tiny bit ahead of us. You know, I think if you look over here and you add these these slices together, you kind of get to that slice. So enormous growth in China as the population gains wealth and they move into the new economy, right? And their focus is the economy, right? If you've been to Beijing, you know, the day I was there, it was hard to see 2 blocks, you know, and that's a fairly typical condition there. You know, there is smog that rivals certainly the worst that we've ever seen, you know, around the Los Angeles area back in the 60s and early 70s. So those are some of the drivers as far as things in society and the world that are making things worse and imparting change. So now what are some of the things that are going to impact that, you know, on maybe an improvement scale, or certainly new paradigms that are going to help us to deal with that? And the first one we talk a lot about is the connected cars, right? And so right now we've got a fairly small percentage of the vehicles that are connected, but this is expected to grow very, very, very rapidly, right? And so it's one of these trends that intersects with a couple of the other trends that I'm going to talk about related to mobile devices and information. And so we've talked about the internet a lot. And so again, just a curiosity on my part, because you know, I'm a little bit older than some of you in the room, but how many of you have always known the internet? Yeah, so several people, well, actually a significant percentage of the people in the room have not known life without the internet. Right? Where my generation knows life without videotape, you know, so that goes back a ways, right? And so now we're talking about the Internet of Things, right? So one of the things that's happened very recently is that the Internet has jumped off of these devices onto, you know, these devices to these devices, and that intersection now is seamless, right? That you expect to be able to go onto your computer and look at a trip and think about a trip and have that information show up on your mobile device and then have that information show up in your car if you happen to be getting in a car, right? And so all of these things are becoming connected and the information is flowing across all these devices, and this is an exploding phenomenon. So the next megatrend in urban mobility is this rise of on-demand transportation. And this applies across a lot of factors. And so Zipcar is an example of having cars available on demand. You know, now has many very similar services. We see the rise of Uber and Lyft, right? Places, so now that you can pick up your mobile device in this Internet of Things, and all of a sudden this car comes rolling up because the car is actually connected to you through the web and a service that is an app that many, many people are building. And so new alternatives in how we get around, you know, across the scale. And this relates to on-demand cabs, you know, traditional cabs, the new, you know, innovative mobility services like Uber and Lyft, but Zipcar, and certainly, you know, public transportation will start to dial into this as well as they start to look at how they harness the real data to make even the more traditional fixed route services more efficient, and maybe even in the future start to look at on-demand services and those sorts of things. So that's certainly a driver. So on top of that now is the crowd and how we collect information and how we get information. You know, so in the past, up to just very recently, all of the traffic-related and transportation-related information that you could get came from a public agency that was their business, right? Or that was their reason for being, their mission. You know, so a Department of Transportation or a public transportation agency or an urban planning organization were the only ones that really collected and aggregated data and made that data available in any way to the public. So you'd have to go to a DOT website to get information or something similar to that. Well, now we've got, first of all, a number of services to ways we can tap the information, but we're also aggregating data from the crowd. So this is this intersection of the crowd, right? So the crowd is actually inputting information. So we're aggregating data now off of all of the different sources. So the traditional kinds of things that the DOTs would do with road sensors and traffic cameras now gets integrated with the kinds of things that INRIX does, and that is connected vehicles and bringing the GPS-equipped vehicles into play and aggregating all of that data. But then information that comes right out of the cars, where a user is driving down the road and they whip open an app and they go, there is a construction zone here that's not on your map. I'm reporting it. Right? Here's a crash here that I'm reporting. And oh, by the way, your traffic color is wrong, so I'm reporting that too. Right? And so taking all of that information from hundreds of millions of drivers and other folks that are observers of the system and aggregating it with all the other data to really complete this data set that doesn't end at a jurisdictional boundary. Right? So that's the other part of it, is if I'm driving from Portland to Vancouver, I no longer have to look at an ODOT website to see what's happening with traffic up to one point and a WSDOT website to see what's happening with traffic up to another point. I can just whip out my mobility app and ask it, how long is it going to take me to get to this address? Right? And it'll tell me. So the crowd. And just to kind of demonstrate the change and the growth in this trend, because we happen to have this data at INRIX. So we're an integrator of GPS-based data, what a lot of folks call either probe-based data or floating car data. And this map represents, just 3 years ago, a 15-minute snapshot in time where each red dot on the map is a single report that we received with a location, heading, and speed, and an anonymized identifier, so we can actually pair the travel times between successive points, of course, across the U.S. And there's no roads drawn on this map. All the red lines on the map are just the individual red pixels that were, readings received from drivers. And this is a 15-minute time slice. This is 3 years ago, and this is now. 3 years ago, now. Okay? And that trend's not stopping anytime soon. This trend has just taken off. So this is Europe 3 years ago. Now. There's now. Now. So again, the scope of the information that's available. So again, when I was with WSDOT a very few years ago, if people wanted to know the traffic and travel times across Washington and the urban areas, first of all, it was only in the urban areas that they had it. And the WSDOT website was the only place that you could go to get it. And anybody else that was kind of reporting it was all getting it from the WSDOT website, right? So now INRIX is just one example of a company, and we have competitors, we're not alone in this space, that is producing worldwide traffic data. We are producing traffic data in 32 countries now, with a goal of being, I think, in 40 by year end and 50 by the year next year and like 60 the year after that. So the next trend is how people are harnessing that data to improve operations. So again, another thing that's changed in the very few years that is certainly just now really getting its legs is actively managing a roadway network and harnessing this vast array of data to do that. And so, again, in the past, the only data that DOTs would use in a traffic operations center was data they collected themselves, right, via sensors on the roadway, put out at a fairly significant expense, right? So now they can look at a map that has system-wide information that they can turn on instantly without having to deploy any infrastructure, right? And so that is a new paradigm shift. And just one example from, this is New Jersey, the Ops Center, enormous facility that is shared between the DOT and the Turnpike Authority, the State Patrol, and the 911 dispatch system, the fire dispatch system. And they're an interesting case because they're a DOT that's been around several years, and it's been dealing with congestion for a long, long time. And so they put out lots of sensors on the roadway 25 years ago, 25 years ago. And due to budget pressures, right, over the years and public transportation agencies, a lot of those sensors have fallen into disrepair, and they haven't had the money to go out and replace them. Well, they're now one of the parties that use the INRIX data for system-wide view. So now, for the cost of putting out 3 or 4 sensors, they can see the entire network. So we're actually touring there one day, and they're looking up on the map, and way up out of town, there's a red line, you know, and it says there's something congested up here, and this is like the middle of the afternoon, and it's like, what's happening there? And it's like they had no idea what was happening there. So they call the maintenance office, and they say, there's something going on this road up here. I don't remember the number of it. And so they went out to take a look. And so the maintenance guy drives up there. State Patrol hadn't arrived yet. No emergency responders had arrived yet, at the point where a gravel truck had tipped over on its side and was completely blocking the roadway with a load of gravel on the road. It showed up in the crowdsourced data before anybody in any of the public agencies actually knew it had happened. And that's how they became aware of it. And again, that was about 2 years ago. So now we would have people pushing on our app, you know, reporting an accident. And they'd actually be able to see that it's an accident that has closed the road there. So how will this change transportation? So one of the things we hear a lot about is, you know, this integrated corridor management, right? Being able to take the data, not only the sensor data, but the big data, and proactively manage the corridors. Moving across the modes. So again, it isn't about just moving cars, it's about mobility. You know, more and more people don't care about driving to where they're going, they just care about getting to where they're going. And then harnessing across all of the different types of services. So not just traffic data, but things like parking data and stuff. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Time check. Okay. So the next megatrend is connected devices. And so I think you in this room, being kind of a tech-savvy group, you're probably already at about 100% penetration of the smartphones, right? And here, many of you probably own more than one of these devices and are connected pretty much all the time. And so the growth of these just in the next few years is going to be enormous. And again, this is a worldwide phenomenon as we look at it. And the percentage of adoption in the US is significant, but the percentage adoption in the developing countries is really just getting started, and this is just, you know, this is taking off. You know, I think the second biggest Apple store in the world is in Beijing. You know, I got to go there. You know, it's like the one in New York City. You know, big market there. So this is a kind of a graphic on just the expected number of connected devices globally. So personalization is the next trend. So where in the past data has been basically non-tailored, right? It's just been, you look at a flow map and you see the traffic conditions, and then I have to look at the routes that I intend to drive and make some sort of a calculation on whether or not, you know, this is the best route to take. Should I take my normal route, or should I take my second favorite route, or my third favorite route, or some other route? So now we're looking at this personalization of data where some of these things are actually here now, but just catching hold, where your trip and your travel time is tailored to your exact experience. And what's here now today is that you can go to apps like the INRIX app, and you can say, you know, how long is it going to take me to get home tonight, right? You have home programmed in there. And it's not, I'm not leaving now, I don't want the travel time now, but I want to leave here at 4:30. What's the travel time going to be, and what's the best route going to be? And oh, by the way, send me an alert, send me a text 15 minutes before I need to leave such that I can get home by 5. Right? And then an alert will pop up and it says, you know, it's 3:30 if you want to get to home by 5. If you need to, you know, leave by 3:45, and this is the route you should take. Okay, that's all here today. The next step is going to be not having to ask anymore. right, is you just will start to move and your device, whether it be your car or your mobile phone or whatever, will go, okay, he's leaving the house. It's 7 in the morning. Every time she leaves the house at 7 in the morning, she's going to work. There's a big crash on her way to work on the route she usually takes. I think I better tell her about that. Okay? And so if I'm driving the car just says, hey, you need to take a different route. Because I think you're headed to work and there's a big crash on the road you normally take. Never having to ask for that information. You know, same sort of thing if I am taking the bus. If I'm headed to the bus stop and I normally take the number 12 bus, and the number 12 bus is going to be late, you know, the device just tells me that. And so I know how, if it's going to be late, how much it's going to be late, or if there's another route, if I walked over a block that I could catch that might get me to the place that I want to go a little bit faster. So I talked about this. Okay, so in-car infotainment, again, is another exploding trend, and it really just ties into the last one that I talked about. Nuance is a major company that supplies these embedded and cloud-based voice recognition services where you can just talk to your car, and it will tell you the best route to take and how long it's going to take you to get home and those sorts of things. And they claim that they're going to ship like 30 million of these devices this year. So 30 million new cars embedded with equipment that you can talk to. You know, because the distracted driving is a big issue. And so, you know, I just want to be able to talk to my car, ask it a question, get the information back, take the best route. The kind of information, you know, that's going to be in there in the connected car, and this is all things that are really here today and emerging. So traffic and incident data certainly is very robust. You know, navigation is here. The multimodal routing, right, is something that is taking hold. We just built a platform for BMW in Europe to where your BMW will tell you when you need to get out of it. Right? So I'm driving toward the city, and driving is not going to be the best option. The car will actually tell me, we recommend you take the next exit, get in this park and ride, and grab this train. It's going to get you to your destination faster than if you stay in your car. So a car company funding information to get you out of the car because they want you to have the best possible experience, right, to get to where you want to go. Road weather information just exploding and how that's being delivered right now. Again, local search, not just static search, but search related to what's happening right now, right where I happen to be, you know, and delivered into the vehicle. Fuel prices, something that's just being deployed now, and parking availability. You know, something that I goofed up on this morning as I came here because the address that I had didn't take me right to the entrance of the garage, right? And so I went in the wrong entrance, right? And so that's something we're actually fixing with our routing. Is like, you know, the real-time information gives you the availability and the pricing, and then the nav takes you to the door of the parking garage, so you don't end up circling twice like I did, because that's a congestion thing, right? You know, in big urban areas, it's been estimated in peak hours that 30% of the congestion is people circling the block, trying to find a place to park. And so, first of all, if we can tell them where to park and get them there more efficiently, that alone will have a significant impact on congestion. So those are the 10 megatrends that just wanted to kind of talk about briefly. And then just a couple other factoids to go with it here. So anonymous driving, or autonomous driving, this is one of the things that when you talk about, you know, Mr. Musk with Tesla, I mean, this is a person that has something on the ball. And this is something he intends to deliver on. And he's delivered on a lot of things that he said he intended to deliver on, which I think is going to be extremely interesting. Because does this incent people back in their cars a little bit? I don't know, you know, because of a lot of the other factors that we talked about. But the thing that, to me, could be the most interesting about autonomous driving is, first of all, you don't hear a lot of people talking about how this could be applied to transit and really change the face of transit with minibuses that work on demand with all this information that don't even maybe need a driver at some point in the future, that sort of thing. But what happens if, after I get at work, I could send my car home to park? and then and just tell my car, I'm going to be at this point in time, come pick me up, right? What does that do to transportation, right? Because the technology really is going to enable that. You know, it's going to be societal decisions on whether or not we allow that kind of thing. You know, right now, everything we hear about autonomous driving is there will have to be a driver in the car, right? But this is before we even get to the part where there's real autonomous vehicles on the system. So what becomes the ask after they've been on the road for 5 years and they've proven they can actually work completely autonomous fashion? What happens next? Okay, so now I wanted to talk about, shifting gears a tiny bit, some evidence of the trends and things that I think you can relate to that make this a little bit real, and then comes the challenge. And so this is a trend that a lot of people are talking about that has changed. So they call it the twisted trend, right? And this growth in VMT. So when I started with the department, WashDOT in 1984, it was 2.5% to 3% per year growth in VMT on every single roadway, every single year. You could just count on it, right? Just count on it. And that continued to the year 2000. You know, so for my first 20 years at the department, it was like growth in vehicle miles traveled and the system was basically constant. You know, you could just count on it. And then people started to talk about the reduction in congestion and the reduction in traffic related to the recession in 2007. And as I started to look at those numbers at WashDOT, I was telling people, this reduction didn't happen in 2007, and it wasn't related to the economy. This trend bent in the year 2000, and people just haven't figured it out yet. Now people are starting to write about it, and I was exactly right. The growth in VMT per capita started reducing significantly about the turn. And what happened? It's a number of the things that I talked about started to take hold. I would actually like to think that, certainly in our state, the Growth Management Act actually had some things to do with that, you know, actually incentive in growth and that sort of thing. But the other trends are bigger than that, because this is not just a Washington State thing that was pretty proactive, or a Portland thing was very proactive. This is much bigger than that. And these, I think, these are now the things that people are talking about that were the drivers. And you see some of these things were the megatrends. Some of these things are things that have actually played out already. So the top one, you know, was the entrance of women in the workforce. You know, for years that was actually a growing percentage. That's plateaued. Basically, it's maxed out, right? And stagnant, or maybe even backing up a little bit, but it's stagnant. And same types of things, the baby boomers having a huge influence, right, in the number of cars and those sorts of things. So I have a house with a 3-car garage and a shop that parks 2 more, right? And it's full. One of the slots a boat, right? And that's not atypical for a boomer. My son's 27. He's never owned a car. Takes a bus everywhere he goes, right? And likes it that way. To him, he sees the car as an expense. You know, for me, you know, it's a necessity. Completely different way at looking at how we get around and how we want to live and how we do live that is generational. So playing into that. So think about this trend as we move forward a tiny bit for the challenge. Because this is one of the things that we've heard lots of times in my profession, and I'll bet you've heard this statement before as well. We cannot build our way out of congestion, right? I think I've seen that quoted in some of the stories about the CRC, in fact, right? We're not going to build our way out of congestion, right? It's also been long assumed that VMT will continue to grow. And this might actually be true in the longer trend because of the growth of population, right? Certainly population growth is going to continue to grow. That's a big trend. And the urbanization, so we have a lot more people moving to the cities. So VMT around the cities is going to grow, but VMT per capita is going down, right? Hence the twisted trend. So here's the challenge, or this is the next fact, sorry. Freeway capacity for my entire career at the DOT is been known to be something about 2,000 vehicles per hour per lane, right? I think many of you probably use a number similar to this, right? And then you have critical lane volumes in the intersections of around 1,300, and those numbers have been the same for a long, long time. We're getting a lot better at calculating the real exact number, right? You know, on individual sections of road where we break down from free flow to forced flow and those sorts of things. And of course, one of the things that's a big dilemma on freeways is that right when we need it the most, you know, we allow the freeways to overload, and the carrying capacity goes from 2,000 or as high as 2,200, measured at 2,400 peak in some places, vehicles per lane per hour down to about 1,300 because we go from free flow to forced flow, right? And so about right when we need it the most, we allow the system to break down to about 60% of its maximum efficiency. What will smart cars do to this number? Because this breakdown from free flow to forced flow right now is because it's just a free-for-all out there, and we're relying on the human to make decisions and to be the buffer between vehicles. And so a long time, you know, when you learn to drive, you were probably told leave so many spaces or 2 seconds between cars, right? Always 2-second following distance. So that's the traffic engineer's math, right? There's 3,600 seconds in an hour divided by 2. That's 1,800. The 2,000 vehicles per hour per lane. Those things kind of fit together, right? That's 2-second headway. What do smart cars do to this number? Yeah. So right now, we're already seeing the implementation of adaptive cruise control systems and auto braking systems. All somebody really has to do is say, oh, by the way, once you're actually tracking that car in front of you, suck up that headway. You only need 2 milliseconds to react, not 1 second and 1/4. And so instead of following at 1 3/4 seconds, follow at 3/4 of a second. Very doable with the technology that exists today. You don't even have to connect the vehicles. You know, that's just adaptive cruise control. That's just one thing that's here today. So now considering this, considering that we have VMT per capita going down, and we have essentially virtual added capacity coming into the system, is this statement still true? And so here's the challenge. Here's what I want you to think about. We talk a lot about the next transportation package we're going to build. You know, in Washington State DOT, this was the focus constantly. Whenever you would get funding for a new round of projects, there are people working the numbers to figure out the package for the next round of projects. And that is not atypical. I mean, that is not, you know, individual to WashDOT, right? That is something that you see in many, many DOTs. The challenge is, instead of talking about the next transportation package, what if we started to talk about the last transportation package? You know, instead of talking about the CRC as one individual element, what if you put all of those factors together and said, here's the last things we need to build in Portland for the next 100 years? That would actually be a package that would be affordable because of the factors that we've talked about. How would people relate to that differently instead of saying, here's the next things we should do, instead of, these are the last things we need to do for this community, and this is what it's going to cost. How about we get it done? So this is the last slide, and back to our company a tiny bit. The information to quantify the extent of the congestion across the system for North America, not just Portland, is actually loaded in an analytics suite waiting for people to look at it. So I ran this analysis this morning in 5 minutes, including clipping it into the graphic, to identify all the bottleneck locations in Multnomah County for the last 3 months. And I can easily see the extent of the congestion, the extent of the backups, temporally where it fits, the duration and the patterns, and I can do that on freeways, and I can do it on arterials, and I can do it everywhere across the country. So with this kind of information, could we start to talk about the last transportation package? So that is the end of my presentation, and I'm hoping that prompts some discussion. So question, who wants to be first?
Gabriel Russo, graduate student. I did have kind of a question that you sort of alluded to when you were talking about the work that BMW is doing or funding. So can we use this data, obviously, to predict trends? We know when rush hour is. We know demands, peak demands, things like that. Can we use this data to actually force consumers off of certain arterials and onto other roadways, thereby reducing overall demand on a certain major roadway that's always congested?
So yes, we could. Forcing people to do things, though, some governments are better at that than others. Right? Sometimes we try and force people to do something, and there's this bit of this backlash. But one of the things people are working more and more on is incenting people to make the change. All right, so what if I'm driving down the road, and my car says to me, there is an extreme slowdown ahead, and we recommend you get off the next exit and take this different route that you never take, right? It's going to take you 10 minutes longer than the shortest path available. But this route actually has the most available capacity. You know, by the way, if you do it, at this Starbucks, in the drive-thru, there's a coupon waiting for your coffee. Now, is that different than saying, don't go on this road because it doesn't have enough capacity? It's like if you take a different route, here's a little something for you. So we need to bring the microphone to whoever's going to be the next speaker. So you go ahead and just pick one. And
hi, Andy Kading, engineering student. Talking about altering behavior by telling people to take a different route, do the systems that your company employed, do they have the feedback time that you can get instantaneous results? So I mean, if I check my app and it tells me to take this route, are the next 100 people behind me going to have the same information, and therefore it could potentially cause congestion on the route that you're trying to?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And we actually talked about that a lot on WashDI, right? It's like if you tell people to divert, most of the routes that you're asking them to divert to have got very little extra capacity, right? And as the road reaches capacity, it's not a linear equation on the increase in delay, right? It's exponential. And so when you break it down, then it hurts a lot. So the systems right now don't do that yet. So that's what some of the active traffic management systems do. And because it takes some second-level modeling to do that. So certainly that's being done off-board. What's happening right now is people looking at using our kind of real-time data that goes beyond where they have sensors to make those decision support systems smarter, right? And right now, we're not yet to the point where the information is delivered to enough people on the route and enough people actually listen to it and move that this has become a problem. And so I think the developers are kind of ahead of it. But I mean, it's definitely something that people think about a lot. It's a good question. I'll just let you pick.
Destiny, graduating student. My question is, you mentioned about looking like package of the future instead of looking back. So how can your data benefit, like old vehicles or things in the past? How can your data
So how can the data benefit older vehicles that are not yet connected? And the answer to that really is in the smartphone penetration, right? And so when you bring your smartphone into the car, it's really now a connected vehicle. And so you could even be, how old the car is, as long as I have the information, I can get certainly a significant amount of the benefits of a connected vehicle. I won't be able to do like the adaptive cruise control types of things, so the system benefits will only be from diversion and not through the technology of greater capacity. So those things will take time. It's just a trend to implement.
Boris Kaganovich, TriMet. Given the shortage of funds to maintain the existing roadway network and effectively the one virtual capacity that we get from smart autonomous vehicles, could we talk about reducing the size of the existing road network in anticipation of this reduced VMT and increased virtual capacity in terms of making it maintainable?
So that's a really good question, and I think you could talk about that, but I think you have to also talk about it in context of the population increase, right? And so it becomes, in my mind, and you probably know the number much better than I, but how many years is it expected to be before the population of Portland doubles, or Multnomah County doubles? Is it 15 or so? 15, 20 years, population is going to double. So the question kind of becomes, instead of reducing the network size, is if I double population, can I get by with the same network, same roadway network, to accommodate twice as many people?
I'm Jia Kang, graduate student in urban studies. You listed 10 megatrends impacting on the future transportation, and I think consumers changing trends such as people's behavior, attitude, or lifestyle is also really important, impacting on the future transportation. And I see you listed a generational preference on the trends. So can you talk a little bit more about this?
Sure. So the generational shift, I think, so I touched on that briefly. I don't have a ton to add, but certainly the things you reference are very real, right? The Gen Y, the millennials, really do prefer, much larger percentage than in the past, right, an urban environment. The urban environment has changed. Downtown is a much more fun place to be than it used to be, right? And I don't know how much is contributing by the fact that as many of these people grew up, their parents made them mow the yard that took an hour a week, and they actually don't care if they mow lawn anymore, right? That kind of a thing. They're very happy to walk across the street to the park where somebody else is going to mow the grass, And housing prices and maintaining a house that's large and has a large yard is expensive, right? And it comes now with this big commute if I'm going to work downtown. And downtown's a fun place to be. Why shouldn't I just live there, right? And it's not just the millennials, actually. It's boomers, too, right? And so lots and lots of baby boomers that grew up with the house that had 3,000 square feet and 3-car garage are wanting to downsize. They're trying to sell that house and move into a condo where it's cool and they can walk down and go to Starbucks just like their kids do. Right? And so it isn't just, the generational shift isn't actually just the younger folks. It's the changing pattern of the older folks.
So a lot of the trend analysis you did was focused around congestion and the cost of congestion. There's some evidence that the cost of safety is actually greater than the cost of congestion, and here in Portland we've tended to make safety a higher policy priority than throughput necessarily. What do these trends say about the future of safety?
Yeah, that's a great question, future safety. And so you could do another whole deck right, on safety, and you only have an hour or so. But one of the things that it means is really expanding the focus multimodal, I think, right? Because we've studied for years, tens of years, right, vehicular safety. And fatalities in the U.S. are going down. And so again, 15 years ago in Washington State, we adopted a safety plan we called Target Zero. And when we introduced it, the idea of reducing fatalities to zero was just, couldn't really get it past a lot of engineers. It's like, that is not attainable. You can't do that. Why are you planning for that? And it's like, well, what number should we plan for? What should be the goal, right? And so we kind of got some buy-in. A few years into the plan, as we were doing updates, I was able to point to the trend. Our plan for Target Zero was a 2030 plan, and I was talking about this 10 years ago. If you took the trend line and you actually just drew a straight line through it, it hit zero at 2028. That was the trajectory we were on. And so, kind of became, why don't we plan for this? Now, the modes are important. So when I was in China, it's one of the most interesting things I was asked. So I was in a city that was a medium-sized city for them, which is about 3 times the size of Portland. And they have a tremendous number of people riding around on scooters and bicycles and tons of pedestrians. And it's just this chaos there. Right? And if in China, if a car hits a pedestrian, by law, it's the pedestrian's fault. It's the opposite of here. And so it's a completely different situation as far as the mode share and safety issues. Anyway, what they wanted, their number one ask for data was better transit arrival time predictions. They wanted to be able to predict when the bus was going to get to the stop within 2 minutes of actual time. And the purpose for that, the reason they wanted to do that was to be able to prove to people that were riding scooters and bicycles that the bus was a reliable means of transportation, that they could count on it, so that they could get people off the scooters and onto the bus. Because 6 people a month on the scooters are dying. 6 people a month in a city. Can you imagine the uproar we would have here if 6 people a month on bicycles and scooters were getting killed? And that's what they're experiencing. And so, to me, that's the answer to your question is, and I start to see it in Seattle already, and I'm not as familiar with Portland, but the numbers are low, but as a percentage of the commuters, it's actually significant, and it's something that's not talked about a lot. But pedestrians fatalities and bicycle fatalities, you know, there are several a year. And if you actually do the math on what that would mean as a fatality rate, especially for bicyclists, I don't think you'd like that number. And it's definitely something that needs more attention.
The impact of smart cars on safety?
So the impact of smart cars on safety as a connected vehicle is going to be significant. Because one of the things we talk about a lot that's, like, I think just around the corner is again, it's not just about connecting cars, it's about connecting travelers. And so there's going to be, in the not too distant future, apps where if you enable a function on your smartphone, and I'm a bicyclist or a pedestrian, and a connected car goes to make a maneuver into me, it won't hit me. You know, if I'm willing to say, this is where I am, there are people to say, okay, we'll fix this so the car won't run into you. And we'll start by giving the driver a warning, right? They turn on the right-hand signal or whatever, and it's like there's a pedestrian there, or a loud horn. If I'm about to turn into a bicyclist coming up on the right-hand side, you know, if the bicyclist is connected and the car is connected, that's very doable. And that's being talked about in the industry right now.
Wayne Corrick. What is the lag time between, say, you have Mr. Tesla saying 3 years a car could be driving by itself. As far as like the stakeholders, the infrastructure managers, what's the lag time on their take-up of interacting with smart cars? Are they on board with it, or are they just say, you come up with a car, then we'll change the system, or are they saying, you build the car to fit our system?
So right now, that's a really good question, and I don't have a good answer to it, because I think it takes people like the people that you know wanted to be here today to change that kind of thinking. But certainly, as I talk to planners, and I was talking to a planner at the San Diego Council of Governments, which is a fairly progressive, you know, MPO, about some of these trends, and you know, and so I asked him, I said, so what capacity number are you using in your 20-year plan? Because 2,000 vehicles per hour per lane is not going to be the number 20 years from now. So what number are you using? And his response to me was, we talk about that a lot. And they're making some conservative jumps. But one of the challenges, and kind of was part of the reason I threw this out here, is that if you change the number, people want evidence to back the number up. And right now, there really isn't any. Right? Yeah, and so if you're going to be a planner, it's like, do I stay safe, and do I stay within the existing trends and stay between the things I can prove, or the things that I can reasonably impute? Right? And maybe there's some bookends. there, right? Maybe we start to more talk about some ranges, right? If things stay kind of the way they are, this is what we need to do. But we really think that this is highly likely over here, right? And making sure that folks kind of see those differences and what it means and how we would build infrastructure. Because certainly we still need to build infrastructure. It's just about building the right things in the right places. So she's been waiting a long time there.
Hi, I'm Amy Huddleston. You mentioned that this morning you mined the data for the Multnomah County congestion information. So how does INRIX provide all that information to people, and I guess how do they make money providing that information to people?
Yeah, so those are two questions.
Well, I meant the second one, the second question.
The second question is, how do we make money providing the data, which is an important question, because if we can't make money doing it, we don't exist, right? And then the data doesn't exist. And so we make money off several different channels we refer to in the business environment as verticals, right? So different market sectors. And about half of our revenue comes from car makers. Right? And so you could talk to your Ford today and ask it how long is it going to take you to get home today, and it will tell you, and it'll give you a recommended route. INRIX does that calculation for Ford. You know, they have a mobile app, Ford Destinations, that goes with the car. We built that for Ford. You know, and so we do that for BMW and the Toyota Intune platform in the U.S. and lots of things for Audi in Europe, and we just did a deal with Volkswagen. And so connecting the cars, you know, today with this kind of information, you know, parking on top of traffic, those sorts of things. You know, there's big changes there. So that's a primary venue. Then the secondary market right behind that is public sector. And so that's the world I live in. You know, coming from a DOT, it's my job to go around and talk to DOTs and say, look, here's this wealth of information you're not using yet. You know, how about you pay a little bit of money and use this? You know, kind of the example I talked through really quickly is real numbers. It's like, for the cost of putting out 3 to 5 detectors, I will give you data for your entire system for the next year, right? And one of the reasons I ended up at INRIX is I didn't retire from the DOT and then go find a second job like a lot of folks do that are about my age. INRIX started to talk to me about this data. I got so excited about it and things that I started to tell them, you ought to do this and you ought to do that and you should think about this. And why don't you do that? And they said, why don't you just come here and help us do all that? Okay? And so I decided to make that jump and do that. And so, because one of the things that DOT and public agencies don't think about enough is this power of and. You know, INRIX was marketing their data as a replacement to sensors. I said, you guys are so missing the boat. I said, WashDOT's got 6,000 sensors, and they give me a ton of valuable information. But if I had your data sitting on top of the entire system, I'd completely rethink how I'd deploy them. I wouldn't need near as many, and I'd have more information. It is one of these things, if you combine what the public sector is doing and the private sector is doing, you can actually have more information and pay less. You just have to do it. And so that's the other channel. Then the other part is media, and so providing information to media and the web. You know, companies like MapQuest, if you go to MapQuest and click traffic, that's INRIX data, and so that's kind of the remaining channels. And then fleets. We get a ton of this data off of fleets because they had the first connected vehicles, and so we provide data back to fleets and fleet services. And that kind of makes up the spread of the revenue verticals.
All right, let's thank Ted for his excellent presentation. And just a reminder to turn in your questions and join us for next Friday's seminar from our own PSU's Stefan Busey about why doesn't that traffic signal ever turn green, an evaluation of roadway markings for cyclists. Thank you.